Good evening, everyone. My name is Tyler Okamoto. I'm a professor in management and the Associate Dean Academic within UQ's Faculty of Business, Economics, and Law. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's UQ ChangeMakers panel discussion on Does the 4-Day Week Work? But first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. Noting that we have attendees from every corner of the globe tonight, I would like to extend that respect to the traditional owners wherever you might be joining us from. We recognize the incredibly valuable contributions of our First Nations peoples here in Australia and in the broader global community. I would also like to welcome our speaker and panelists joining us here tonight. Professor Deborah Terry, AC, Debbie Bailey, Shannon Quain, and Associate Professor James Kirby, who has very kindly agreed to join us on the panel in place of Dr. Timothy Ballard, who is unfortunately unable to make it this evening. A very warm welcome also to our distinguished guests, UQ alumni, staff, and friends of UQ. We are very privileged to host more than 550 viewers tonight from over 35 countries, Denmark, Kenya, Mongolia, all the way to Japan, and all the nations in between. Thank you for joining us, and welcome. Tonight, our ChangeMakers series turns the topic to, does the 4-day week work? As more and more large organizations around the world experiment with the 4-day model, debate continues around the likelihood of broader adoption and whether it really works. Fortunately for us, tonight we have the chance to ask our burning questions of our distinguished panelists. I don't know about you, but I'm hoping to find some new insights on what impact this shift could have on workplace culture, productivity, and the shape of our working lives in the era of AI and remote work. Let's begin by welcoming UQ's Vice Chancellor and President, Professor Deborah Terry, AC. Debbie is a highly experienced leader in the Australian university sector, as well as an internationally recognized scholar in psychology. She is currently a fellow and past president of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, as well as an appointed member of the ARC Advisory Council, among other roles. Debbie began her distinguished career at UQ in 1990 and rejoined us in August 2020 after spending 6 years as Vice Chancellor of Curtin University in WA. To open our event today, please join me in welcoming Debbie. Over to you, Debbie.
Thank you, Tyler. I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm recording today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge our panellists and thank them for participating in this ChangeMakers discussion in which we'll be exploring the question, does the 4-day week work? As we navigate a post-pandemic world and our workplaces grapple with all the possible impacts of technology and artificial intelligence, today's discussion is more relevant now than ever. When we first kicked off our UQ ChangeMakers series in 2020, the first year of the pandemic, many of us were working from home. The technology that we used to bring our global alumni community together to discuss important issues was also giving us new insights into how we could achieve a more flexible work-life balance. In fact, that very first ChangeMakers webinar in August 2020 discussed how new technologies would change the way we work and live. Since then, this ChangeMakers series has explored topics ranging from the future of farming to corporate social responsibility. It occurs to me that many of our ChangeMakers topics have been associated with productivity, about how much each of us can contribute through better management styles, education, and new technologies. What's significant about today's discussion on the 4-day week is that it forces us to rethink our assumptions about what productivity means to us, not just as employers and employees, but as partners and carers. Can using our time more judiciously, both at work and home, improve society through its impact on health, well-being and relationship satisfaction? Trials underway around the world are showing that people can often get as much and even more work done in 4 days as they do in 5. What's also interesting is that there's been relatively little change to the standard work week over the past 100 years, despite the large productivity gains we've seen over that period. In his 1931 essay, titled Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, the economist John Maynard Keynes imagined that by 2030, technological advances would mean we'd be working a 15-hour week. The promise of a more balanced lifestyle also seemed a real prospect in 1988 when Brisbane hosted the World Expo, which had the theme Leisure in the Age of Technology. Perhaps Keynes was right, given that in recent years we have begun to see momentum towards a new industrial model based around a 4-day week. Last year, the Australian Senate Select Committee on Work and Care delivered a report recommending a 4-day week trial. And I know that trials have also been underway in many of the countries from which our alumni are joining us now online. So welcome everyone to this discussion with our highly esteemed panel of UQ alumni as they ask, does the 4-day week work? I'll now hand back to Tyler to get that discussion underway. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Debbie. Now to introduce our panel, please welcome Debbie Bailey, Consultant Partner, 4-Day Week Global. Debbie is an expert in driving transformative change across organizations, including local governments, national charities, and international companies based in Australia and overseas. As the founder of Debbie Bailey Consulting and consultant partner with 4-Day Week Global, she specializes in the design, implementation, and trial of the 4-day week and reduced hours working solutions. In this work, Debbie has guided 4-day week trials in businesses around the world from a variety of sectors, including local government, community services, retail, health services, knowledge work, financial, and the not-for-profit sectors. Also joining us is Shannon Quain. Shannon is a UQ alum and an experienced senior executive with 20 years experience leading people and culture teams for both government and the nonprofit sector. Shannon is currently the Chief People Officer for the Australian Digital Health Agency. She has led people and culture teams as a senior executive across multiple jurisdictions and states for both the government and the nonprofit sector. A self-described HR nerd, Shannon loves to keep across contemporary practices, research, and events to understand how she can best serve her team and organization. And our final panelist tonight, please welcome Associate Professor James Kirby. James Kirby is a clinical psychologist and the co-director of the Compassionate Mind Research Group at the University of Queensland. He examines factors that facilitate and inhibit compassionate responding. His work examines the clinical effectiveness of compassion-focused interventions. James also holds a visiting fellowship at the Center of Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University. In 2022, he authored Choose Compassion, and in 2020, he co-edited Making an Impact on Mental Health. Let's jump right in. Each of you has extensive experience in your respective fields, so we're hoping to harness some of your insights throughout this discussion. We're going to jump to our own questions, and then we'll transfer to the audience questions. Thank you again for everyone who has sent these through. Now, I thought it might be useful to just start off by framing the question of what we're talking about here. Do we mean squeezing all of our work into 4 days? Or do we mean reducing the total amount of working hours? Debbie, do you want to start us off to help define this for us?
Absolutely, we'd love to. So when we talk about the 4-day week, we're really talking about reduced hours. We're not talking about really long days and trying to do 4 lots of 10-hour days. So the 4-day week started on the premise of 180-100. So 100% of the pay, you do 80% of the hours, and you are able to, 80% of the hours, so long as you maintain 100% of your output. So basically, you can reduce your hours as long as you still get all of the work done and you can maintain that pay. But there's variations. So you have the 4-day week where it might be 4 lots of 8-hour days. There's also a 4.5-day week where there's a half day on a Friday. There's organisations that do a 9-day fortnight. I'm working with a fashion designer in New Zealand who are currently doing 9-day fortnights because they're a 7-day-a-week business. There's also the variation of 5 days with 6-hour shifts. So you're still reducing the hours, you're still getting 100% of the pay, and you're still required to produce 100% of the outputs. So it's definitely about reduced hours, not those longer hours.
Okay, so the focus is that 100% output, 100% pay, take as much time as required.
Absolutely. On the basis, you get that reduced time only on the basis that you've done the work. So if you don't get the work done, then you don't get the time back.
All right. So from an employee's perspective, what advantages and drawbacks might be associated with the 4-day work week? So how does this actually impact productivity, satisfaction, the balance between work and personal life? Shannon, maybe I'll start with you. How does this affect employees?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. For me, working in the Australian Public Service, we really do want to look after our employees. They are critical to the delivery to the Australian community. So it's really important that we do offer flexibility and having an opportunity for people to be able to think about how they interact with work, and that real harmonisation between work and life is critical to their delivery, their well-being, and how they actually feel like they're contributing not only to the workplace, but to the outcomes that we're there to deliver. So any way that we can support flexibility, any way that we can think differently about how flexibility could work. We do want to think about person-centred design in anything that we do. And so I'm sure that we'll hear throughout tonight, not one size fits all is kind of the mantra that I have in my head when I think about flexibility, especially when it comes to what works for one employee will not work for another, and what works for one organisation will not work for another. And I think that's got to be critical to this, that we're not trying to throw up one solution. It's really about, let's get the data, let's figure out what works, and then let's jump in and see what we can do.
All right, so it's really about the best model for the work that's being done to make sure that both productivity and employee benefits occur.
100%. We really want to make sure that we are outcomes focused and we deliver. That is what public servants are about. That real, value add to the community is critical. So the balance between wellness balance as well as delivery has to be critical.
Any other benefits to note, Debbie?
Yeah, look, I think when you talk about flexibility is great. One of the disadvantages that can come from an employee perspective is when you're in the planning stage of implementing a 4-day week, sometimes it might mean that some of that flexibility has to come back during that experiment or during that trial period, simply because if you're currently working on 3 or 4 days work from home, you actually need to have a little bit more crossover when you're doing a big change process like this. So that's one thing that might change. But the benefits are there when you know that you've got half a day or a full day, that you can dedicate that to carer responsibilities, medical appointments, housework, or doing simple things that normally causes a bit of stress during the week. What we tend to find is that people know that they've got that day. They tend not to take longer lunch breaks. They're not taking extra sick days. They feel calmer, less stressed, and more able to cope with the work that they're doing and focus on it. So there's some great benefits for the individual as well.
All right, so you mentioned stress and well-being. So maybe James, this is your area of expertise.
Yeah, the mental health part. I think it's wonderful that we're having this kind of discussion about what kind of society we want to live in and the amount of work we're willing to kind of give of our lives. You only got one chance at this thing, so what do we want to do with it? I think that's really wonderful because we know working really long hours does impact people's mental health and well-being. I mean, just this year, the amount of times I've been called out to run workshops for people's mental health for different industries, teachers, education, paramedics, and so on. There's lots of burnout, lots of distress, and lots of kind of feeling burnt out and exhausted from the ongoing nature of work. So trying to do something that tries to structurally have an impact on the well-being, I think, is a fantastic movement for us to consider, and it's wonderful to hear the different ideas and trade-offs from such an approach, because it'll be different for different people in different professions. I mean, I think of some of that work which is emotionally very draining. So think of judicial officers having to make decisions about child sex offenders or something like that. Coming into contact with that day in, day out, 5 days a week is exceptionally draining on one's emotional well-being. And there's lots of different professions like that. So having a 4-day week where you're still able to produce the outcomes that are required from you, but you're not being exposed to that same level of perhaps trauma each day could be incredibly important for long-term well-being.
Yeah, so super interesting. Now, one of the other things that I've heard about the 4-day week is that it comes up in conversations about gender equity. And so I was just curious about how that works, Shannon. Is it just about opening up a recruitment pool to people that have carer responsibilities, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think there's an element of let's put something in place because this will happen as a result of it. And I think we saw through COVID that, you know, a lot of the traditional gender roles and the pressure that put on people to work, but also look after their family, look after their children, we saw that fall to traditional roles of women throughout that process. And so any consideration of putting something in place that requires more flexibility, we know that there is a cultural shift required, and it's not just the cultural shift about time or how we work, it's that cultural shift around gender norms and where we need to do some work in that space. I know there was a study done in the UK recently where there was still the traditional held view that if you worked part-time you were limiting your ability for promotion. And then there was, I think in the same set of research, men tended to take a harsher view on people who were flexible in regards to they thought it created more work for the people that were left behind by those who did flexible work. So I think it's putting something in place, but as Debbie has said, it's all the things around it as well that we would need to consider. So it's not just about how do we make the workplace more flexible for the mum to pick up the kids. It's about how do we make work more flexible for people to be able to do whatever's important to them to make their value and contribution work as well as the organisation.
Yeah, so it's like destigmatizing the flexibility.
For sure.
Yeah, all right, great. Have you seen evidence of this as well, Debbie?
Yeah, look, there's some great research out there. And again, back to the UK, there was a really big trial done of the 4-day week a couple of years ago. Over 60 companies, 2,700 participants. And the results showed that when people were working on a 4-day week, the distribution of household chores actually became more even. So they particularly noted that if men were working a 4-day week, their contribution at home increased. If both men and women were working a 4-day week, it became more evenly shared. So there's a lot of evidence like that. I know that Saudi Arabia, in particular, their Vision 2030, they're actually having a look because one of their largest part of the population who are not currently employed are university-trained women. And so they're actually looking at, is there potential for the 4-day week or a 4.5-day week to actually attract them into the workforce so that they've got that balance of other commitments that they have. And then just anecdotally, I work with a local government in British Columbia in Canada. And one of the workers who's just in the start of his trial was very excited because he now has Mondays off, and his wife is even more excited because the jobs they had to do on a Sunday, they can now enjoy the weekend and they do all the housework together on a Monday. So it's just that really simple lifestyle changes that have an impact not just for the person but also the rest of the household.
Yeah, that's great. Now, from an organizational perspective, 4-day work week sounds pretty scary. From a general manager's viewpoint, I would imagine that you worry about productivity, you worry about performance. How can it actually work if you're paying people the same and they're working less?
Yeah.
Does this actually make economic sense, Debbie?
Yeah, so having been a CEO several times over, I totally come and understand from that perspective. You're very worried about, I'm paying wages, these people are not here. Are they producing what they need to produce? So from my perspective, the 4-day week, first and foremost, is a productivity exercise. It's not a wellbeing activity. It's about the business first. So this is about improving productivity, getting rid of waste, improving efficiency. The happy outcome, which is consistent through all the research, is that people, their well-being improves, the stress goes down, the absenteeism goes down. So there's some great bottom line benefits that come with it. But absolutely, I get that it's scary and it is risky. However, if organisations follow a considered process and actually work through that risk management and plan, you don't suddenly turn on a switch and suddenly go to a 4-day week. You actually have to change your behaviour. So it takes quite a bit of courage for a leader to want to do this, and it also takes a leader who's prepared to do it themselves. Those are the most successful organisations and successful trials that I've seen. So yes, it's scary. However, the bottom line benefits can be quite significant. 65% reduction in absenteeism in the UK study. 57% reduction in resignation. So when we're in an era where we are struggling to attract staff and retain them, and in Australia, I think it costs, the minimum cost is $23,000 per position to recruit somebody. That's a huge expense. So as a leader, if I can find a way to reduce my turnover and reduce those costs, it makes economic sense to me.
All right, that makes sense. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear you say it takes courage, because I think that's a really important value that we need to lean into if any type of change is put in place. And to be honest, as a public service leader, it makes me nervous to think about how would we make this work. Because as I've said in the beginning, providing value to the community, if I can find more productivity, doesn't that mean I can deliver more to the community? And so the balance between the effort of putting in, finding productivity, that is what we are trying to do all the time, and then thinking about the value we can provide in terms of taxpayer money, delivery, making a difference in the lives of others. And then it's that juxtaposition and that dissonance I have around, but I know that it will help the employees in regards to their productivity, their well-being, and all of that information you said. So, reiterate the word courage in that it's going to take some time and some energy and some effort, and also a cultural shift.
Yeah, thanks. I like the idea of courage there, and you mentioned culture shift, and so maybe I'll ask James. What are the psychological factors here that are relevant? I mean, you mentioned culture, and I think of how kind of a leader's trust in their workers, or the level of accountability that's built into the systems and processes. How does that play out?
Yeah, I imagine there's many different factors at play here. With culture, there is this kind of funny juxtaposition almost of Australians being laid back, chilled, kind of, we take it easy, don't worry, mate. However, at the other end, there's this kind of real shame that's applied because there's this badge of honour earned from really pushing oneself. I didn't have a weekend this weekend, and it's like, oh yeah, God, my work wouldn't allow me to do that. I have to do this and this. It's almost your work value matters depending on how much time you're spending engaged with the work, and how many sacrifices you're making in terms of missing contact with, say, child events or whatever it might be. So I think that's a real problem. So at one level, we've got the culture of, aren't we laid back? But then we've also got the culture of, working long hours is a badge of honour and a source of pride. And then there'll be different work cultures as well. So like, leadership, I think, is really important, as you mentioned. And if your leader isn't setting the example and saying one thing but doing another, that's going to create some dissonance as well within the workplace as well. Like, hang on, how legitimate is this? Is this just going to be about creating, job losses in order then to free up some money to allow this, or whatever it might be? So all that kind of gossip then around what might happen can be a source of friction as well, I suppose.
All right. So say that I'm sold on the cost benefit. I imagine that it's actually the process that really matters, the how. It's a pretty major change. And so to Debbie, how would an organization actually go about thinking about a workday, 4-day work week transition?
For sure. So look, the first place I'd start is, what's your motivation? And what I often see is that there's a burning platform. The organisation might be really struggling with absenteeism, they can't fill shifts, they can't get people to turn up or even be recruited into roles. So what's that burning platform? And also, what's the culture like in your organisation right now? So it's not a magic wand. You can't suddenly go to a 4-day week and you have this amazing workforce that all work beautifully like they've never done before. It's not going to work like that. So you need to have a serious look about where you're at as an organisation. If you're in the midst of a major transformational change, you probably don't want to add something else on there. However, if you're an innovator, you're looking to lead your sector, you want to do something different, then you might be in the right position. So the basic things you want to have a look at is, what's the outcome you're looking for? What does success look like for you? And then how are you going to measure that? And once you've got those measures, or you've identified those measures, what are the non-negotiables? Because as leaders, it's really important. We need to have some tolerances built into any trial or experiment process. So it might be that we don't want to spend any more from a staffing budget. It might be that we are not prepared to compromise on our service hours. We need to maintain 5 days a week or 7 days a week. So you figure out those non-negotiables. And then the secret ingredient is you hand it across to your staff. This is a grassroots consultation process. You are not the expert in your staff's jobs, they are. And so what happens in this process is you've got this motivation piece. So you talk about culture. Yes, we can improve productivity, but what's the motivation? If you're going to give me the opportunity that if I work differently and I change my behaviour and I'm going to maintain the same outputs and you're going to give me that extra time back, I'm going to find a way to work differently. and I'm going to find a way to work collaboratively across these different teams. So it's that grassroots consultative process of those teams on the ground actually coming up with the solutions.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, the kind of two big points that I got there, not only just the change process itself,
Yeah.
But also the idea that it's supported by a culture that is outcomes-oriented,
Yes.
task-oriented, rather than one that's process-oriented.
Very much
in a way. Shannon, reflections on this question?
Yeah, I think I really resonate with the what's the problem you're trying to solve piece in terms of why are you doing this? And it's not just because it's a trend or because someone asked us to. It's really about designing something that works for your organisation. And I think it's being flexible in the approach in regards to that co-design with staff and how we do that. And I think that's a cultural shift in itself in regards to handing over things. Is, you know, managers struggle, I think, with this. I think human resources, to be honest, struggles with this because we are supposed to be the experts. And we really are the ones who we want people to call us and say, how do we fix this? And we should be able to tell them. So moving to a more human-centred design approach in anything we put in place, whether it's more flexibility, a 4-day work week, or any type of HR policy, process, procedure, anything, we need to be more human-centred. So it sounds like that sort of thing could be consistent across the board.
Yeah, and I like that idea that once you put it in their hands, they will tell you what will work and what won't work. I mean, thinking of my own context and experience, certainly there are pockets of university life and academia that have a tendency to be a bit workaholic at times. And in that particular culture and that particular lens, I can imagine that even with the opportunity to pull back, people might not be ready to, might not feel about it.
Yeah, and I think even in the public service, busyness is that thing of that badge of honour. Sometimes that's rewarded. And so I think we've got to think about how we position that in regards to the piece of the puzzle around the leadership element. And it's that shadow we cast piece in that people will follow what the leader does. And we really need to consider that in any design. So, but that's the hard part, right? You got to do the walking as well as the talking.
Totally get the leadership piece. Are there any other little hacks, James, maybe that help us break our workaholic habits?
Yeah. I mean, it's yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, it's very.
And then walk the talk.
I mean, it's interesting. Like, you know, I just think of clinically some of the clients I've worked with. They've kind of worked their whole life, and that's their sense of who they are. They've sacrificed a lot for the work, right? So it's builds a big part of their identity. So they've kind of really connected with that sense of identity. And then they're willing to perhaps transition at the point of retirement. But it's like, you know, you've spent 40 years maybe in this kind of mindset. And then to go about like a sharp shift like that, it might be nice in the short term after a month or so, but then they start to get a bit fidgety, you know, and then it's kind of like if you haven't built in other routines within the lifestyle in order to engage you, you do open yourself up to feeling like, what am I contributing? What am I doing with my everyday life, and how am I having an impact on others, which is really important for well-being and social connection.
Yeah, well, and you talk about those sorts of issues, and it makes me think that there are definitely individual differences in whether work is energizing to people or whether work is draining to people. And in those sorts of situations, you know, how do leaders kind of manage that fairness and equity aspect of work? If there are people that just want to be at work all the time and they love it, and then there's people that are struggling to come in on Friday.
This is where I think it's really important for leaders and managers to lean into their role as coaches, and they really have to understand what works for that individual employee, what motivates them. It's okay to have a team of people who want different things and work in different ways. That's why leadership's so hard, because it's not one size fits all. And you know, if we talk about hacks in regards to what happens, I mean, the ultimate bad hack was COVID, and look what happened. We had to adjust because of the way the world worked at that time. So I think it's probably identifying, well, what's the thing that's going to tip you over to that next change that you need to make, and as a leader, if you've always got to keep your eye on that future, that's got to be the thing that's going to help you take it to the next level. And also the recognition that it's really hard, and what support do you have? What help do you have? That's going to be a critical piece for any leader.
Yeah, and it'd be nice to walk into something like this consciously and deliberatively, rather than just letting another COVID tell us.
I'm not touch wood somewhere. No COVID anyway.
Yeah. So certainly the devil's in the details, and I would imagine that just as many cases there are that talk about how this works really well, there's probably a few that maybe don't go so well, and there's probably something that we can learn from that. Debbie, any learnings from
absolutely. So, couple that worked really, really well. A 24/7 service, City of Golden Police Service in Colorado in the States. Amazing. So they've just completed a 6-month trial. They're going into their next 6 months. They could not fill positions. They could not get people to do the jobs. They did a 4-day week trial. Their positions are full. Their resignations have gone down by 50%. They have reduced their response call times. And they have increased their community engagement. So that's a really good example of a taxpayer-funded service that's actually done this really well and is then spreading to the rest of the government entity as well. Another great example is Stellenbosch University near Cape Town in South Africa. So they have recently just completed their trial. So they actually did a student services trial. And so that's the psychologists and the disability workers, OTs, so all of that cohort. So they had 66 staff that participated. And what they found is that they had a significant reduction in sick leave. They had an increase in retention. Their sick leave from March 23 to March 24, one year it was 51 days off in the month, and the next year it was 6. And the other bonus that came with that is that student access to the services went from a 3-month wait to just on 2 weeks, which is comparable to the private sector. So that's amazing. So those are great news stories. But yeah, it can be challenging, and it's not necessarily something that fits for every single sector or every organisation. So when we see that it doesn't work, there's a few common themes that might happen. So it might be that the leadership has not walked the walk and talked the talk at the same time. So they haven't tried to do things differently. Another thing that happens is that people don't plan. They simply just jump into it and think that they're going to get a different outcome. You might have a change of ownership that happens. Some organisations retain a very high level of flexibility and find that it's very hard to get that crossover. And then there's other examples where external influences can change the ball game, basically. So there's an organisation, an engineering company in New Zealand that turns their 4-day week on and off based on the economic climate and what's happening. And their staff know that. So they make it work for them based on what's happening, whether it's a recession or not, and how the engineering sector is flowing. So there's a few different factors that come into it, but it really comes down to that really good planning and actually committing to it. And you're not going to get it right in 6 months. There are some organisations that have to keep practicing for 3 years. It's an ongoing iteration that you have to keep working on.
Yeah, it comes back to that employee-centered idea that you were talking about. Any lessons learned on your side, Shannon?
Look, I think the public service has come a long way in regards to flexibility. So we've got great principles now in regards to, flexible work is the way that we want people to work, but it has to be a mutually beneficial arrangement. It has to work for the organisation and the employee. And we do want to have a focus on face-to-face contact and engagement, because we know there's lots of research around the importance of that for connection and productivity. It's not something that we're ready for yet, I don't think, because we haven't done the pre-work. We haven't done the burning platform for what is it, how do we measure productivity to say this will make a difference to us, is a really critical piece that I think we're a bit lagging on. But that's part of the exciting thing, right? Because there's plenty of opportunity for us to think about, well, how can we make flexibility work? I know in my organisation, we offer remote work, hybrid work, we offer, compressed hours, job sharing, part-time, all of that sort of thing. This is the next layer. I don't know whether we're ready for it, to be honest, though, because I think I'm still very much old school public service in one way, around the more productivity I can get, I need to deliver that. So I need to have a mindset shift to go, oh, how could we do this in a way that works? Because I'm very much focused on those outcomes and what's the leave liability if we're creating less if we're creating an opportunity for people to take less leave, that leave liability builds up. And then we saw that throughout COVID, that people didn't take their leave, and now we've got people with these large leave liabilities that then they need to take that throughout the year or take it all at once, and that's creating some real workforce planning challenges for us. So for us, there's a thinking in, well, is that part of the thinking? If we did something, what does that mean? How do we need to do it? So we're on a journey, and I think it's like anything, we've got to figure out what works for us, and then do a trial, do a pilot, and see what happens. I don't think we're there yet, though, for a public service. Hate to be the bearer of bad news. I'm happy to be wrong. I just don't think we're there yet.
Well, and I like the metaphor of that it's a journey, and you might look down the road and might realize that maybe that's not for you, maybe there's another option, and just being thoughtful about that and going about change in the way that you should.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the thing. We've got to be open to new ideas, new ways of thinking. Diversity of thought is what makes us a great public service as well.
So you mentioned retention earlier. I'm curious about the extent to which the 4-day week becomes a bit of a competitive advantage for organizations. Have you seen that play out as well?
Absolutely. So there's lots of research there, companies that have actually implemented this. Their quality job applications will increase between 100 and 400%. It's incredible. And people will say, there's research to show that people have said that you would have to pay me 150 to 200% of my current wage to go back to a 5-day week model. It's just simply a lifestyle game changer for individuals, but also for businesses. So yes, so if for businesses that are struggling with retention and attraction, so for example, there's a lot of examples of hospitals in the US that have adopted the 4-day week, particularly for their nurse unit managers. In Australia, we've got a huge crisis in our medical sector. We're in 2025, we're going to have 155,000 shortage of RNs. We need to be looking at it differently. We can't keep burning out our staff. This is an opportunity for us to think differently and apply it in a way that we can attract people into these sectors and hang on to them for these critical roles.
Thanks. Now, I thought we might go to some audience questions.
Sure.
There's been a lot of questions coming in as we go, and prior to tonight, but also as we were talking here. And so we're going to try to get to as many of these as possible. So our first question comes in from Callum, who asks, would there be a recommended way to approach the 4-day model in an organization that operates via billable hours? So navigating the hurdle that reduced hours equals reduced opportunities to bill and gain revenue. Have you seen anything in that context?
I can jump on this one. Law firms. Great example when we talk about billable hours. So there's a really good case study. If you look up Y, capital Y Law, Vancouver-based law firm, they've done a blog on their 4-day week journey. So their burning platform was that they would train lawyers up and then they would leave. And then, so when they left, that slowed the business down. They lost billable hours and revenue went down. So they decided to trial the 4-day week. And what that looked like for them was that they actually took Wednesday as the gift day or the day that they could take back. But they maintained 5-day a week service. So what happened is they had admin staff that would still check emails, they would triage, the lawyers would check at them at one point on that day, and the business could keep flowing. As a result of this change, they actually were expecting and they budgeted to reduce their billable hours by 10%, thinking that that's a fair enough cost if I could retain the staff that I've got. The hours didn't reduce. In fact, they increased their billable hours and their ability to create billable hours. And so what happened is that their revenue went up, their staff retention went up, and their profits went up. So by looking at their processes, and there's so many examples when you look at a 4-day week, you have to look at your processes, your systems. You need to ensure that you're doing something different. And so they did that and they streamlined their processes, but they also had a different way that they were approaching their work. And as a result, people were super focused on the work that they needed to do and the billable hours, and they were able to increase, and they've grown as a business.
Interesting. That super focus piece. I mean, there's a motivational component there, isn't there, James?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It's fascinating listening because there's like 2 levels of measurement really going on. Like the individual unit, how they're going as an individual with the. If you've got reduced hours, how are you producing the most? But then also the organisational as a whole team, as a whole unit across time, which might be slower, and how they're showing their outcomes as well. So there's so many different layers to the measurement that you can cherry pick if you'd like, and kind of to push an idea. But I mean, it just seems overwhelmingly from the work that you've been talking about, Debbie, on how organisations that have adopted this, it hasn't been without, little bits of, trade-offs and struggles.
Absolutely.
But there's benefits for both the individual, but also the organisation as a whole, which I think is really, amazing. And it gets back to that kind of fundamental question by Aristotle around what's the good life? What is a good life? During my experience as a worker, we went from Sundays being no work whatsoever to then being open. And for me, that was like huge. Like I couldn't believe that the shops were open. Like it was just a revelation that this could be a possibility. And for me as a young adolescent, that was great because I could go out and socialise and do what I wanted. So the idea of doing something different, which isn't continuously opening up, being connected, being available all of the time on a device, taking 7 hours, 24 hours, they'd probably create a 25th hour somewhere if they could. But so like taking a different shift for me, someone who knows I've got 30 years worth of work left is kind of quite refreshing.
Yeah, I think reflecting on my own journey in this space, I think I used to definitely be a all hours, 7 days a week workaholic, and then I suddenly had the excuse of family to be able to draw a line, and I found myself being more productive when I'm at work. I might be a little less social when people come knocking for a chat, but certainly I get more done in a day than I would ordinarily. Thinking that there's no boundary to how long I can be working.
That's right.
So our next question comes from Karen, who asks about that journey piece. So Karen wants to know if there's anything that can be done to accelerate the adoption of a 4-day week among business owners in various different sectors.
Yeah, I think it probably for me goes to the reason why you're doing it.
Okay.
If you think about any change journey or any process that you're going to put in place, being really sure about your why and understanding how you're going to do that and what support you've got in place would be a critical element. And also I think what you're willing to trade off. So it might be that you can't have everything, but this might be the step to getting you to the next layer and then building and building and building. So I think for me, it would be around how clear are you on what you want to do, what support do you have in place, and where are your limitations?
All right. So basically doing it systematically rather than just kind of letting it flow and seeing what happens.
Yeah.
Less experimental, more thoughtful.
Yeah, I don't think this is something you can wing it. I don't think this is at all something you can do. My dad always did say, you've got to have a system, So I think anything to do with this and any big change, it does need to be systematised for it to work, and you've got to be really thoughtful about any change.
Yeah.
I think the other thing you could do with this also, while you're thinking at that micro level, the macro level is that we know that leaders need to have courage, and we know that there's safety in numbers. So one of the things that you can look at, and there's been good success when there's been group trials or country trials, but then also sector-related trials. So if you're able to have a group of universities have one section of their university. So the student services example from Stellenbosch, I know that they've presented to other universities, so wouldn't it be great to see a sector trial happen there? What about charities or not-for-profits? What about local governments? Because then you have like-minded entities working together and you can share the lessons and the learnings, and then also the communication and all sorts of strategies that go with that. So I think some of that acceleration could happen at that macro level where we start to look at sector-based trials as well.
I appreciate you not saying, what about the public service?
I picked up your message. We're going to take a little bit longer, a little bit more thought.
A little bit more time. I'll get there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've got another question that kind of relates to something that you were saying, Shannon. Bonnie has asked, I imagine the industry is critical, but keen to know the metrics that you're tracking in the companies that you're supporting and helping with this. Bonnie's a founder of a company that's adopted a 180-100 4-day work week, which has been positive, but she's wanting to be very specific about the productivity metrics. Devil's in the details.
That's it. And I'm very passionate about measuring productivity. It's something that I think there's lots of different ways to measure it. There's the economic impact, there's the engagement, the staff engagement impact. There's all different ways that people measure it. And in the public service, we don't have a set way of measuring productivity, which hopefully we will one day, but we're not quite there yet. So I think that's got to be really clear for people. What are you trying to measure? So you know when you get there, you know you can celebrate your success and say, this is what I was aiming for. And I'm sure Debbie's got lots of examples of how people have measured productivity in their businesses. But I think knowing what your measure is, that you then say, that's what I'm trying to deliver, lining up the work to reach the outcome would be a critical piece. But I'm sure Debbie's got a great example.
Look, and you're absolutely on the right track. The thing I would add is that whatever success looks like, your measures are going to fall out of that. And so you might already have some measures that you don't think are productivity measures. If you've got government funding, you've probably got KPIs or an SLA or things that you need to ensure that you deliver on. Atom Bank, which is an online bank in the UK, they actually had, I think it was nearly 400 measures. Now, that's the extreme end. Yeah. I've seen others that have had, say, a dozen or so. But whatever it is, it falls out of what does success look like? What are you trying to achieve? What's the outcome you're looking for? And you start to drill down there. So you always want to ensure that your customer service does not decline. Customer satisfaction has to be retained. Your service levels have to be retained. Your quality needs to be retained. Your revenue most likely needs to be retained. So those are really common, easy ones. If you do sprints, you might be looking at sprint velocity and any changes there. How are you going from a scope creep perspective? How are you going from OKRs or your quarterly goals? How are you tracking on those? So you can go complex or you can go really simple, but always pull it up to that higher value of what are you trying to achieve, what does success look like, and what are the non-negotiables for you?
Yeah. So what about those situations where an organization is in kind of a growth period, where maybe let's call them the human resources are perhaps not enough to achieve very lofty aspirations? Does that just mean that it's not the right time to go this route?
Well, I think it probably goes back to you can't do everything. And so if you're already going through a transformation, I probably wouldn't say, let's add more change, because we know how much everyone loves change. So I think there's an element of choosing your timing to be able to say, well, it might not be the right time because you have to do, you have to get to A and then B before you can do C. And then I think it's a matter of, well, which one's more important? Does C come first? That's got to be a business decision.
I think it really comes back to your culture too, doesn't it? If you've got a culture where you're able to sustain that growth and that agility. So there are a lot of startups that do a 4-day week because they're agile and they can move and change quickly. Public service, maybe not so much. It takes a little bit longer for things to change. So depending on the maturity of the business and where you're going and that culture that you've got will determine whether you can actually quickly move and adjust and adopt this.
Can I just add, like as a researcher, there's that element of quantity, for example, like how much you publish or whatever it might be, how much money you're bringing in, coupled with this idea of, well, it's the quality of the work that really makes a difference. And when you feel like you're pressured with time and you have to deliver the new Sputnik idea tomorrow, you can't. It's just impossible. And so, it has felt in some ways that there's this increased push on immediate short-term output that you can say and quantify, hey, by the end of the week I've got this. But that big idea, which takes time to germinate and you need space to allow it to ferment, has kind of been, I think, compromised to a large degree. Like I feel like in the past, when I look at the cohort above me generationally, Tyler's age and higher, I think to myself, of course, I'm just jesting. I've got a lot more grey hair. So much work. But when you look at that previous generation, there was this idea that you had perhaps a longer period of sabbatical that was available to you to really kind of learn and absorb, to then try to transform the way you were thinking, which could lead to a really powerful game changer in your field, and for my case, and helping people with depression or whatever it might be. Whereas when you're just working on those really short-term kind of outputs, that gets compromised massively. Because to kind of track and quantify that, I think is really difficult.
And when you keep working that way, things don't change. So one of the cool things that I see when you transfer or you change the way that you work with a 4-day week, you're starting to build focus time into your day. You're blocking time, you start corralling and you start holding your boundaries. And so we know, and I'm sure you'd be all over the research around, when people are more rested, they tend to be more creative. And they're able to produce more work and they feel better about it, and there's more innovation that comes through. So the business not only gets a more creative, happier and more innovative person, person, but they also get more work being produced at the same time, simply by reducing the hours, but allowing them to focus and chunk up the day so that they do have that and they don't have this constant pressure of running from one task to the next and doing that context switching all the time.
So do you think it's just fear that makes people not do this? From what you've seen, is it people afraid? Because it sounds like the research and all the evidence and the trials that have happened have been so positive, overwhelmingly positive. So is it that we don't know enough yet? And the pessimist in me goes, well, we don't have enough longitudinal data to tell us then what was that further impact? Or is it fear? What do you think? Do you see fear in people and when they come
Absolutely.
about this?
I see CEOs that sign up and I start working with them are still fearful. I had one that started their trial at the beginning of September and she was, I don't know how we're going to go, but it's a bit of a leap of faith. However, because you're going to behave differently, you're asking people to do some change. I think the other thing is that it's hard to get your head around when you talk about 4-day week. Well, that sounds like every Friday off. Well, that doesn't work for my business or your business, so that's not going to work. But when we start talking about reduced work hours or 4.5 days or 9-day fortnights, then we can start to get our head around it a little bit and understand there is some benefits that can come from that. So I think that it's learning a bit more. It's about understanding it's not one size fits all, and also that there's resources out there and so many case studies that you can look at to help you through that journey.
Yeah, it's not just black or white.
No.
There's a lot of different versions of it, and you have to work with what works for you.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. So we touched on this very briefly, but I want to hit it harder. There's a lot of questions coming through about macro. So in a economy that holistically is not growing, is widespread adoption of the 4-day work week going to be problematic from a productivity standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I think that economic indicators are going to be one of the things that we need to have a look at when we consider any decision that is made. And I think it's that unemployment piece and then the GDP and how we're actually going to consider whether the cost of not doing something is more than doing something in regards to changing the way we work. And if I think about economy in regards to health outcomes, in regards to, we talk about, that preemptive care as opposed to, waiting for tertiary system to kick in. Is this just another version of that in regards to, are we really having to focus on the primary care and the primary stuff and the preventative stuff? Is this an element of that when we're thinking about health indicators and what the impact that has on the economy? I don't know, maybe. Do you see any research on that?
A nice easy one.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I didn't either, that's why I asked you.
That's right. Debbie will have the answer.
Look, I think developing economies, for sure, there's a challenge. Like I know, because I was talking to one of my colleagues in South Africa actually, that really high unemployment over there as compared to us. So the right to disconnect is highly relevant for us, but not so much over there because you want to hang on to your job. So I think in developing economies, I think maybe some of the options are gradual. Implementation, so phased implementation. You don't want to get to the point where people are just working longer hours. That's not the answer. It's not going to work. You still need that rest component, and people can't focus for that length of time. So, I think there's a possibility and there's some opportunity there, but I would be thinking that we're talking gradual and phased for those markets.
So, a couple questions. One from Marika that's asked if there's any discussion around less time and less pay models, so like a 0.8 time. Another question that's from an anonymous viewer that's kind of related is thinking about an implementation where some team members elect to lean into the 4-day week and others don't. And just curious about those kind of different models and what you've seen.
Yeah. So the less pay, less work, less pay, absolutely. I think there's a hospital in South Korea where the nurses actually have done a 4-day week trial. Wasn't on the basis of the 20% reduction in time, but it wasn't 20% reduction in pay, it was 10%, which was negotiated. They still had very positive outcomes from the trial, but that's, it's an isolated pocket there. Traditionally, certainly in our part of the world and our sectors, it tends to be that people are looking for maintaining that pay rather than doing a reduction. So that's probably more common from what I can see.
Okay, all right.
It's an interesting piece around the less time, less pay. I think that's a really strong element where we might see a gender issue in regards to people. We know there's a flexibility gap of about 15%. I think that was from the latest WGEA reporting around that gender pay gap. So I think that people would need to consider why they're doing that and for what purpose, and then the cultural elements around it in regards to are people culturally disadvantaged because there's an expectation that if you don't work full time, you're not ready for promotion. So that's one of those myths maybe that could be busted.
Yeah, well, there's a broader piece there too, where if you're not measuring productivity in a reasonable way, then models like that could be problematic because people with cares responsibilities that take the reduced load end up working longer hours anyways because there's no line about where you need to work towards that you can say 80% of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think the success happens because the 4-day week or reduced hours working, it's the carrot. There's motivation. If you get all of your work done, I'm going to give you your full pay. And that's what motivates people. If you ask them to change how they work now and work harder, well, they're not doing it. You've got to have that motivational piece.
So before coming here, I was having a conversation with my partner about this topic, which she loves. But we were curious, how does the 4-day work week operate with teachers? So I can imagine, it sounds like a great idea from my perspective, unless the teachers were also doing it. So how does this work in an education context?
So the US is doing it quite a lot
Yeah?
because they're able to manage their own school funds. And part of it is that it might be a shortage of teachers. It has driven them to this, so that's their burning platform, or it might be limited access to resources potentially. What I have seen, and it works very well in certain parts of the US, is that they might go Tuesday through to Friday or Monday through to Friday. And the day that the students aren't going, the community actually is able to contribute and connect. And so there might be a special place that's set up where people go and they continue educational activities, but the parents themselves are able to keep working and maintain that flexibility. It helps significantly from a staff attraction and retention perspective. And I know we've got major issues with teachers in Australia and hanging on to them. So I think it's something we definitely need to explore a bit further.
Interesting. All right. We'll take that one away to think about. Maybe Shannon's got some solutions?
No, definitely no solution. My husband's a teacher. So yes, he would, I'm sure.
He wants his 4 days too.
He's yelling it through the screen right now, so I'm sure. But look, I think it's that public service mentality piece of, and also then what's the economic cost would have to be an overlay in regards to what do working parents do if their children or child is not at school. And then I guess that's part of the challenge, right? In terms of those benefits and what else can come. So I wish I had a solution, but I don't.
and whether children can be efficient in their learning. So unfortunately, we have only time for one last question. This question comes from Amanda, who joins us from Canada, and has asked, what is the strongest argument in favor of the 4-day work week? So kind of your last point to make.
Well, for me, it's the bottom line. So as a former CEO, it's all about reduced absenteeism, increased staff attraction and retention, increased productivity. If I know that I've got a team there that is going to work even harder for me and I can fill all of the roles that I've got, it's a no-brainer for me. From a bottom line perspective, my business or my organisation is actually going to continue to grow and develop and be more sustainable with a model like this.
All right. Shannon?
Yeah, I'm going to be that person that then goes, I'm not going to pitch for the 4-day work week is for everyone. I think that individual context, flexibility and coaching and leadership conversations is the start of then what could you do to impact on outcomes for your organisation and for your staff.
Great point. James?
And just taking a kind of thinking of my child who's 4 and then 8, what kind of future do I want them in? I would prefer it if they were working less and engaged with life more. But that's just personal.
I like the big picture.
Yeah.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our discussion this evening. I hope you're able to gain some valuable takeaways from our panelists. It's been wonderful to have so many members of our extended UQ community joining us tonight. Thank you again for taking the time to engage with us. I encourage you to keep the conversation going by networking with your fellow alumni in the UQ ChangeMakers online community. You can find all the details that's on the slide on your screen now. Now, if you've heard any nuggets of wisdom that you'd like to return to later, remember that there is a recording of tonight's discussion that we will circulate to everyone who registered, and that circulation will come over the coming week. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you again to our panelists. Hope you have a great night or morning, wherever you are in the world. Take care.